Cal Harker pulled the collar of his duster up against the November wind and pushed through the door of the Dusty Creek General Store. The bell above the door gave a thin, tired ring, and the warmth inside hit him like a wall. The smell of pine resin, coffee grounds, dried tobacco, and the particular dusty sweetness of bolted flour. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust from the flat white glare of the Wyoming sky to the amber dimness of the store's interior. It was a Friday, which meant the store was busy. Ranchers from the outlying spreads had ridden in for supplies, and a handful of their wives moved between the dry goods shelves with the careful economy of women who made every dollar count. A cluster of men stood near the iron stove at the center of the room, arguing about fence line, their voices carrying with the easy confidence of men who expected to be heard. Cal found himself an empty spot near the end of the long wooden counter and set down his list. He had ridden the better part of 12 miles from the Double Pine to get here, and his joints reminded him of every one of them. The man behind the counter, a red-faced fellow named Orvis Webb, who owned the store and half the opinion in Dusty Creek, was holding court with two ranchers. His voice boomed and his hands moved as he talked, and he showed no particular sign of noticing Cal had arrived. Cal waited. He was good at waiting. It was in the waiting that he noticed her. She was behind the far end of the counter, half hidden by a tower of stacked canned goods that somebody had left in a precarious arrangement. She was young, no more than 22 or 23, with dark chestnut hair that had been pinned up in a practical knot, though a few strands had come loose and fell against the side of her neck. She was sorting through a pile of fabric bolts, matching a woman's whispered request against the store's inventory with quiet efficiency, unrolling a length of calico to hold it up to the light. Her face was striking in a way that had nothing to do with fuss or effort. Clear-eyed, a straight nose, a mouth that was set in a line of concentration that suggested she took her work seriously. She wore a plain shirtwaist, the color of dark spruce, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows. No ribbons. No ornamentation of any kind. The woman she was serving said something in a low voice, and the girl at the counter gave a measured nod, refolded the calico with practiced hands, and reached for a different bolt without a moment's hesitation. She had done this 1,000 times. No one else in the room seemed to register her presence at all. "Webb," one of the ranchers said, slapping the counter. "Tell me you've got the number 9 wire. I need it before the ground freezes solid." Orvis Webb excused himself from his conversation and lumbered down the counter, nearly brushing past the young woman without a glance. She stepped aside, smooth and automatic, the way a person steps around furniture. Cal watched her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at his list, though he found he wasn't reading it. This was Nora Callahan. She had been behind that counter for 2.5 years, ever since the death of her father had left her with no homestead to speak of. The bank had been faster than the grief, and a very precise understanding of what it meant to have nothing but her own competence to live on. Mr. Webb had taken her on because she could cipher in her head faster than he could on paper, because she could read a supply ledger and find a 3-cent error in a column of 80 numbers, and because she asked for a wage that was, frankly, an embarrassment to what her skills were worth. She had known that when she agreed to it. Nora Callahan was not a woman without pride. She was a woman who had made careful, clear-eyed calculations about survival and had acted accordingly. She came early and stayed late. She knew every item in the store by its shelf position and its price. She knew which ranchers were good for credit and which ones were not. She had reorganized the entire back storeroom, which had been a chaos of mislabeled crates, into an ordered system that cut Webb's restocking time in half. He had never once remarked on it. She did not expect him to. She had long ago stopped keeping a ledger of what she was owed in acknowledgement. That ledger would bankrupt her in a different way. The woman who had requested the calico made her choice, and Nora measured it out with a wooden ruler, cut it clean and straight, and wrapped it in brown paper with a practiced fold. She wrote the amount in the ledger, made change from the till, and said quietly, "The blue will hold its color better than the green, Mrs. Prentice." The green lot this season fades after the second wash. Mrs. Prentice, already turning away, paused. She looked back. Is that so? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Prentice studied the wrapped package. Well, thank you for saying. She tucked it under her arm and went out. Nora turned back to the counter and found herself looking at a man she hadn't noticed come in. He was tall, with the kind of frame that came from actual work rather than ambition. Dark hair going a little gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 or 4 days. His eyes were the direct, unhurried kind that reminded her of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, where looking carefully at the horizon was a practical skill. He was looking at her with a focus that made her want to check if she'd spilled something on herself. "Help you?" she said. He set a piece of paper on the counter and slid it toward her. His hand was large, the knuckles weathered. "Supply run," he said. "Double pine outfit, out on the Laramie Road." She pulled the list toward her and read it through once. Nails, salt pork, dried beans, lamp oil, a spool of waxed thread, a new draw knife. Her eyes moved down the column with the quick precision of someone scanning a text she already half knew. "We're short on the number 9 wire," she said. "Everybody came in for it today, but I can put your name on the next shipment. Should be in by Thursday." He nodded. "That's fine. Everything else I can pull for you now." She came around the counter without waiting for a reply and moved toward the shelves along the back wall, reaching without hesitation for the right canisters and the right sizes. She set things on the counter one by one in the order he'd written them, which was also, she noted, the order of the shelves from left to right. He'd been here before and thought about where things were. She noticed things like that. When she got to the draw knife, she had to go to the back storeroom. The tools were kept on the middle shelf, third from the left, in the order she'd arranged them herself. She found it without a lamp. When she came back, he was standing where she'd left him, not trying to flag down Orvis or peer over the counter or otherwise fill the silence with unnecessary movement. He was simply waiting. She set the draw knife on the counter and began totaling the list. 31 cents short, she said, looking up. "Unless you want to leave it open until the wire comes in." "I'll settle it now," he said, and put the coins on the counter. He watched her write in the ledger. "You found that draw knife fast," he said. It was not quite a question. She glanced up briefly. "I know where everything is." "I could see that." He paused. "Webb ever tell you that?" She met his eyes for a second. There was nothing in his expression that looked like flattery or amusement, just a straightforward observation, offered without apparent motive. "No," she said. He nodded, as if that answered a question he hadn't asked out loud. He gathered his goods and touched his hat brim. "Ma'am." He went out. The bell rang. Nora stood for a moment, still holding the pencil. There was something discomforting about being observed by someone who seemed to actually be paying attention. She was not used to it. She wasn't sure she liked it. She went back to work. His name, she found out through the frictionless information sharing of a small town, was Cal Harker. He ran the Double Pine as foreman for an outfit owned by a man named Aldrich who lived back in St. D. Louis and had never once set foot on the property. Which meant, practically speaking, that Cal Harker ran it as if it were his own, held it together through 4 winters and 2 dry summers on reputation, skill, and a stubbornness that the hands under him seemed to find more reassuring than oppressive. He came back to the store 9 days later. The wire had come in. Nora had set aside the amount from his order before anyone else could ask for it. He noticed that without commenting on it, he put the coins on the counter. She was in the middle of helping a rancher's son find the right size of boot when she became aware, from the corner of her eye, that Cal Harker had picked up a ledger she'd left at the near end of the counter, the store's accounts ledger, open to that week's entries, and was reading it with the calm, unhurried attention of a man doing nothing wrong. She felt a flicker of irritation. The ledger was not a private document, strictly speaking, but her handwriting was in it, and her organizing system, and the quiet logic of the way she'd rearranged the categories to make the entries faster to find. It was more hers than it was Webb's. She finished with the rancher's boy and came to the counter. Cal set the ledger back down without haste. "You reclassified the credit accounts by season," he said. She looked at him. Most stores do it alphabetical, he said. But if you group them by when the ranches are flush spring sales, fall drives, you can see at a glance who's likely to pay when. He met her eyes. That's a smart way to do it. No one had ever said that. Not Orvis Webb, certainly. Not anyone. She found she didn't know what to do with it, so she defaulted to what she knew. Keeps the books cleaner, she said, neutrally. He nodded. He took his wire and went. He came back the week after that. And the week after that. He was never without a genuine reason to be there. The Double Pine had real supply needs, and it was the closest store. But Nora was a woman who noticed patterns, and she began to notice this one. He always came on Fridays. He always took the end of the counter. He never tried to insert himself into whatever she was doing, never called out to her from across the room. He waited, and while he waited, he watched. Not the way some men watched, with a measuring, acquisitive attention that made her feel like livestock at a fair. His gaze was different, more like a man studying a piece of country he intended to cross, trying to understand its geography before committing to a direction. She did not know what to do with this either. One afternoon in early December, Orvis Webb called her to the back of the store during a lull. He was standing beside the accounts desk with a look on his face she had learned to read, the slightly too casual expression of a man about to say something he knew wasn't fair. "Business gets soft in December," he said, straightening a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "You know how it is." She said nothing. She waited. "I'm going to need to put you on half days for the winter," he said. "Just until the spring buying starts up again. Can't justify the full wage when foot traffic's down." She kept her face still. She was good at that. "I'll also need you to take inventory on the storage side each week," he added, "so I have an accurate count when the spring shipments come in." He said this as an afterthought, when they both knew it was not an afterthought. He was reducing her hours and increasing her work simultaneously, and he knew that she knew it, and he was betting on the fact that she would not say so. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "Yes, Mr. Webb." She turned and walked back to the counter. She had made no sound. She had not argued or begged or made the situation difficult for him in any way, which would have given her a thin, sour kind of satisfaction, but would also have cost her the position entirely. She was 22 years old with no family and $43 to her name. There was no margin for satisfaction. She picked up the next customer's order and began to fill it. She didn't know that Cal Harker had come in through the back entrance 3 minutes earlier to ask about a freight delivery and was standing near the open storeroom door. She didn't know that he had heard every word. He stood there for a long moment after she walked away. Then he replaced his hat and went back out the way he'd come. He had not slept particularly well in some time. He was aware of the reason and had been choosing not to examine it directly, the way a man probes a sore tooth with his tongue and then resolves to stop doing that and then does it again anyway. But that night, lying in the bunk in the foreman's quarters at the Double Pine while the wind scoured the north side of the building, he let himself think clearly. He was not a man who operated well in uncertainty. He was a man who assessed the situation, determined the most honest course of action, and took it. He had run the Double Pine on that principle for 11 years. He saw no reason to apply a different one now. The cook at the Double Pine had announced 2 weeks ago that he was leaving after the new year. He was a decent man and a poor cook, and the hands had been quietly suffering through his biscuits for 3 seasons. The position was real. The cabin that went with it, a single-room structure built into the lee side of the main barn, warm and solid, was real. The wage was real. The rest of it was also real, but he would address that separately, in his own time, in the way that felt right, one thing at a time. He found her the next afternoon. It was a Saturday, and she came out the side door of the store at the end of her half-day, pulling on her coat with the efficient 1-2 motion of a person who dressed fast out of habit. She was heading toward the boarding house, where she rented a room, a walk of about 4 blocks, and she had her head down against the cold. "Miss Callahan," he said. She stopped and turned. Her expression went through a brief sequence surprise, then the familiar, careful neutrality. She waited. He took off his hat. "I have a position open at the Double Pine," he said. cook and provisions manager. The man who held it is leaving in January. She looked at him steadily, giving nothing away. The wage is fair, he said. I can tell you the number if you want it, he told her. He watched her face register at more than she was making now, considerably more, and then go still again. There's a cabin that goes with the position. You'd be running your own kitchen, ordering your own supplies. He paused. Keeping your own accounts. She said, Why me? It was the right question. He respected it. Because I watched you work for a month, he said. And you're the most competent person in that store, and Orvis Webb is paying you half what you're worth to do twice what he's willing to admit he needs from you. He said it plainly, not as flattery, just as arithmetic. And because I run a tight outfit and I need someone who doesn't need to be told the same thing twice. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying a scent of coming snow. Then she said, I have my father's survey maps. He looked at her. He was a cartographer, she said. Before he died, I have his maps and his instruments. They're the only things I kept. She paused, and something shifted in her eyes just slightly, a warmth behind the careful stillness, like firelight seen through a frosted window. I would need somewhere to keep them that isn't a trunk under a rented bed. Cal held her gaze. He understood that she was not talking only about maps. There's a table in the cabin, he said, under the east window. Good light in the mornings. A single breath. Then she looked away, down the empty street, and was quiet for a long moment that felt less like hesitation and more like a woman making a final, precise measurement before cutting a piece of cloth she'd already decided to buy. She looked back. When do you need an answer? Tomorrow, he said, if that's enough time. It's enough time, she said. She put her hat back on. I'll be here at noon. She was there at 11:45. He'd brought the wagon himself. The boarding house landlady, Mrs. Cordell, stood in the doorway with a look that mixed disapproval with the very slight, guilty gratitude of a woman who now had a room to rent at a better rate. Nora's things fit neatly. A small trunk of clothing, a box of kitchen tools that were her own, and considerably finer than Webb's store inventory would suggest a person of her means could own. A leather satchel with a buckle she kept tight, and the maps a flat wooden case, the kind made specifically for the purpose, fitted with thin interior shelves. She carried it herself in both arms and set it in the wagon bed with a care that told him everything about what it held. Orvis Webb came out to protest, his red face a shade redder than usual. Cal looked at him. It was the kind of look that didn't contain a threat because it didn't need to. Webb went back inside. The drive to the Double Pine was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of two strangers who had nothing to say, but the quieter kind, the quiet of two people who were used to silence and found each other's company easy to be in. She looked at the country as they drove. She had not been this far out of town before. The plains were vast and tawny in the winter light, and the mountains beyond them were the blue-white of old bone, and the sky above them was a pale, enormous gray that went on forever. It's bigger out here, she said. Then what? Then I thought. A pause. Then it looks from town. He glanced at her. She was still looking at the mountains, and on her face was something he hadn't seen there before, not contentment exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first breath drawn after a long time of breathing shallow. The Double Pine in winter was a spare, purposeful place. The main house was log and limestone, built to last rather than to impress. The barn was larger than the house, as barns should be. The bunkhouse sat off to the north side, close enough to the main building for practical reasons. And there, fitted snugly into the southern lee of the barn where it caught the afternoon sun and was shielded from the worst of the north wind, was the cabin. It was small. Nora walked through it in 6 steps, but it had a good iron stove she recognized the maker's mark, a quality piece and a solid oak table under the east window, and curtains that had probably been hung by someone a long time ago and had faded to a pleasant neutral blue. She set the map case on the table. She walked to the stove and opened the firebox. There was a fire laid inside, ready to be lit. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at the stove shelf beside it, a simple plank of wood, at the right height for a person to reach easily from the work area in the warmest part of the room. "This will do," she said. He read enough in those 3 words not to need more. The kitchen at the Double Pine was twice the size of anything she'd worked in before and stocked with real equipment. She took stock of it in the same methodical way she'd taken stock of Webb's storeroom, moving through it on the first morning while the hands were out, opening every cabinet, lifting every lid, checking the state of every implement with the thoroughness of a general taking command of a new garrison. There was a lot that needed organizing. She organized it. The first meal she cooked for the hands was a venison stew, because the pantry had venison, and she worked with what was in front of her. There were biscuits. She made them from a starter she'd kept alive in a crock since before her father died, carried it in her kitchen box wrapped in wool batting during the wagon ride. The hands came in from the cold and sat down and ate. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than she was used to. Not the silence of people ignoring her, but the silence of men who had put a thing in their mouths and stopped thinking about anything else. A young hand named Peavy looked up from his bowl with an expression of startled sincerity. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know what you put in these biscuits, but there's something." She was refilling the coffee pot. She didn't stop. "Sourdough starter," she said, "and thyme." "You can taste it," said another hand, Reeves, who was not a man given to commentary. Everyone looked at him. "Well," he said, slightly defensive, "you can." She pressed her lips together to keep in something that was not quite a smile. She was aware of Cal Harker at the far end of the table. He had not said anything. He was finishing his biscuit with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and when he reached for the last piece, he did it without apology, which she found she liked. A man who reached for the last biscuit without pretending he didn't want it was a man without performance in him. He looked up and found her watching. She went back to the stove. The days settled into a rhythm she had not expected to feel so quickly. She cooked 3 meals, kept the pantry inventoried, placed orders through the supply depot in Cheyenne that she negotiated herself, finding efficiencies in the purchasing that saved the outfit more in the first month than anyone bothered to calculate. She organized the provision accounts into the same logical system she'd built at Webb's store, and one evening Cal came into the kitchen and found her at the table under the east window with the ledger open and a lamp burning, 3 of her father's survey maps unrolled beside it. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "Maps and accounts," he said. "I was comparing the terrain to the supply routes," she said. She turned one of the maps so he could see. "If you take the South Fork past the creek crossing in spring, you cut 2 miles off the Cheyenne Run and avoid the ridge that floods. But you need to know the elevation differential to be sure the wagon doesn't bottom out." He came into the kitchen and looked at the map. He stood close enough that she could see the detail of the stitching on his coat. A repair along the left shoulder that had been done neatly but in thread a half shade off from the original. "That's the Hennessy Crossing," he said. "Yes." "Have you used it?" "Once, in the fall. The ground was dry. Spring would be different." She traced the contour lines with her finger. "But not if you wait until the 2nd week of May. By then, the snowmelt has mostly run through." He followed her finger's path with his eyes. "You know how to read a topo map." "My father taught me." She paused. He said a woman who couldn't read a map was at the mercy of whoever was willing to tell her where she was. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father sounds like he was a man worth knowing." She did not answer right away. She smoothed the corner of the map where it had begun to curl. "He was," she said. They looked at the map together for a while without speaking, the lamplight warm between them, the wind doing its work outside and leaving them unbothered. The other hands noticed, in the way ranch hands notice everything, with pointed silence and the occasional remark designed to be overheard. Young Peavy observed, loudly, to Reeves, that the foreman had been spending considerable time in the kitchen for a man who claimed to have already eaten. Reeves responded that the foreman could spend his time wherever he liked. Peavy said that was certainly true, but that Reeves was missing his point. Reeves said he wasn't missing it at all. The Double Pine's former foreman, a retired hand named Gus who still lived in a small room at the back of the barn and functioned as the outfit's unofficial memory, told Cal one evening, while they were checking the fence line, that he'd been watching Nora Callahan for 2 months now, and she was the best thing to come to the Double Pine since the good well had been dug, and that Cal was a hard-working man with many qualities, but that subtlety was not among them, and that he might want to consider saying something before spring, when the trail hands came back and there were more men on the property for her to talk to. Cal told Gus to mind his fence line. Gus said his fence line was fine. Cal was the one who needed attending to. March came in raw and changeable, with days that threatened spring and then retreated into hard frost. The mountains were still white, but the creeks had started to move again. There was a restlessness in the air that Nora felt in her own chest without being entirely sure what it meant. On a Sunday evening, when the hands were occupied in the bunkhouse and the main house was quiet, Cal appeared at the door of the kitchen. He was carrying his coat over one arm, which meant he had come from inside, not from outdoors. "Walk?" he said. She put down the dish she was drying and reached for her own coat. They walked to the south end of the property, where the land opened up into a wide, shallow bowl that was purple in the evening light, and beyond it the mountains stood in the clear air at a distance that made them look painted. They walked without talking, which did not feel like avoidance, but like the right use of the silence. He stopped at the edge of the bowl and looked at the mountains for a while. Then he looked at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm not a man who says things particularly well. So I'd ask you to hear it out before you decide what to make of it." She turned to face him. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, and her hair had come loose on one side in the wind, and she made no move to fix it. "I have been watching you work for 4 months," he said, "and before that for a month across a store counter. And in that time I have not once seen you do a careless thing or say a thing you didn't mean." He stopped, gathered himself. "I have been working toward asking you something, and I have been going about it slowly, and Gus has pointed out, with less tact than I'd have preferred, that slowly is not always a virtue." The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. "I am not a man with a great deal," he said. "I manage land that belongs to somebody else. But the offer I'm working toward, if I get to it, I have been speaking to Mr. Aldrich, and the Double Pine is for sale if a man wants to make a serious offer, and I have been saving 11 years toward being that man." He met her eyes. "It's not a certainty, but it's a plan, a real one." She was looking at him with the full, still, measuring attention she usually gave to a column of numbers she was working out. "What I'm asking," he said, "is whether you'd consider being part of that plan, not as the cook," a pause, "as my wife." The words sat in the cold air between them, plain and unadorned. She looked away from him, at the bowl of land below them and the mountains beyond. She was quiet for long enough that he became acutely aware of his own heartbeat. "When my father died," she said, "I had to sell everything to cover his debts. The house, the instruments, everything except the maps, which the bank didn't think were worth the trouble of taking." She paused. "I've spent 2 years rebuilding something from nothing. It goes slowly when you're doing it alone." "I know," he said. She looked back at him. "It goes faster with 2. Something in him went very still. Then, considerably faster. She looked at him for another long moment, and what he saw in her face was not the careful, closed stillness she wore in the store, or even in the kitchen, but something open, something that had been kept behind a door for a very practical reason, and was now, with equal practicality, being allowed to step through. "Yes," she said. "Ask me properly, and I'll say it again." He took her hand. It was a straightforward, serious gesture, the way he did most things. He held it with both of his. "Nora Callahan," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not quite a question because he was not quite capable of the vulnerability of a question mark. She had suspected this about him and found she did not mind it. "Yes," she said, "I will." He brought her hand briefly to his mouth and held it there for a moment, his lips against her knuckles, his eyes closed. Then he lowered it and kept hold of it, and they stood there in the cold March evening, looking at the mountains that were still white at their peaks, and slowly, below, going green. "I'll write to Aldrich this week," he said. "I'll look over the terms before you sign anything," she said. He turned to look at her. There was a slow, genuine warmth in his eyes. "I expected nothing less." They were married in May, in the yard of the Double Pine, on a morning that was clear and blue and showed every inch of the mountains without apology. Gus stood up with Cal. Young Peavy cried, which he denied afterward with more energy than conviction. Reeves observed that the biscuits at the reception were extremely good, and nobody disagreed with him. Nora wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue wool she'd ordered from Cheyenne, a color that matched the evening mountains she'd looked at on the night he asked her. She carried nothing, her hands free, ready. The circuit preacher said the expected words. The real ones had already been said on a cold November afternoon outside a general store, in a language of supply lists and survey maps and a draw knife found in the dark without a lamp. 5 years after that, the Double Pine belonged to them. The deed was in both their names that had been a term of the purchase agreement that Nora had written into the contract herself, quietly and without drama, and Cal had looked at it and signed it without comment, which was the same as saying everything. The land was good. They had added to it slowly, acre by acre, in the years of surplus, and held it carefully through the years of drought. The main house had a second room now, and a porch that faced the mountains. On an October evening, with the aspens gone gold on the lower slopes, Nora sat at the porch table with her father's maps unrolled in front of her, annotated now in both their handwritings, hers in the neat, precise columns, his in the practical, angular notes of a man who had ridden every inch of the country they described. A lamp stood at her elbow. Inside, she could hear the low voices of the 2 hands they'd kept on for the winter, and the quieter sound of their daughter, Clara, age 3, engaged in some serious and sustained project involving a wooden spoon and a tin cup. Cal came out with 2 mugs of coffee and set one beside her map. He sat in the other chair and put his boots up on the railing. He reached across and picked up the corner of one of the old maps, the one that had led them to the Hennessy Crossing, the first plan they'd worked out together at that kitchen table, lamplight between them. "We were right about the May window," he said. "We usually are," she said. He looked at her over his mug, and there it was, the same direct, unhurried gaze that had unsettled her across a store counter 5.5 years ago. The gaze of a man who was paying attention, who had always been paying attention. "The accounts are good this year," she said. "Better than last. If the spring is kind, we can talk about the north pasture." "The north pasture," he agreed. Clara appeared in the doorway with a wooden spoon and a look of considerable self-importance. Nora opened her arm without looking up from the map, and Clara climbed into her lap and settled there with the boneless certainty of a child who knows exactly where her place is. The mountains turned from gold to gray, to the deep, transparent blue of full dark. The stars came out, first one and then all of them at once, the way they did out here where there was nothing between a person and the sky. This is what it looks like when someone is finally seen, not loudly, not in a single grand moment. It looks like a man who notices which draw knife is missing from the rack and finds it, in the dark, without being asked. It looks like a woman who writes her name into the deed in neat, precise ink and does not make a speech about it. It looks like 2 people who learn to speak the same quiet language, one careful act at a time, until the language became so natural they no longer heard it as anything other than the sound of their ordinary life. Being seen is not a gift that arrives. It is a thing that is built, slowly, the way good land is worked, with patience and attention, and the willingness to look at what is actually there, rather than what is easier to overlook. Sometimes it begins with a woman who knows where everything is, in a store where no one has ever thought to ask. The right person doesn't always arrive with fanfare or flowers. Sometimes they're the one who notices quietly, without making a production of it, that you've been doing remarkable work in a room full of people who never thought to look. And when that happens, the best thing you can do is let yourself be seen. Put down the armor. Trust the person who found the shelf in the dark. Your life can expand from that one small act of letting someone in. A small note for you, this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted with the hope of bringing you a few warm moments of entertainment, and maybe one idea worth carrying into your day.